October 17th, 1989. A Tuesday afternoon in San Francisco. The temperature is 75 degrees and the skies are clear. A perfect day for a baseball game. No one is aware that one of the most powerful natural forces on the planet is about to manifest itself. At 5:04 p.m. Part of the continent begins to move, and San Francisco moves with it.
Yes. So it's important to reach. Oh, Mike!
Most people called it the San Francisco quake, but the epicenter was actually 50 miles to the south, near a mountain called Loma Prieta. In an area accustomed to earthquakes, this one struck like a hammer.
I just changed clothes, sat down on the couch, and that's when the quake started. Sort of a slow roll, and then, you know, then it's that like a snap or a shock wave, and it just threw everything forward.
It was tremendous, believe me. Thought I was I just held on to dear life.
My TV screen popped out, and glass began to break, you know, things like that. A big marble table flew across the room and shattered like glass almost, you know.
It was horrible. So I've lived here so many years, I've never felt an earthquake like this in my life. Never.
The Loma Prieta earthquake lasted just 15 seconds. But in that quarter minute, Northern California suffered $6 billion worth of damage and 62 people lost their lives.
My guess is that earthquakes are really so scary because you don't have any warning. It's the only thing besides a nuclear war that can really, 1 second you're living in a big, beautiful city, and 10 seconds later it's flat.
Devastated Alaska has begun the task of rebuilding after the greatest earthquake ever recorded. Anchorage, with a metropolitan population of 100,000 hardy souls, was in the center of the severe shock that ripped down 4th Avenue, the main shopping street.
One of the greatest earthquakes to hit North America was a 9.2 tremor that struck Alaska on Good Friday, 1964. A camera on board a ship docked in Valdez recorded the draining of the entire harbor as a chasm opened up in the sea floor. Earthquakes leave their trail of destruction on every continent. In 1948, the city of Fukui, Japan, was leveled by a tremor several times more powerful than the atom bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Every day, the planet is shaken by hundreds of little earthquakes. Most pass unnoticed. They usually occur along the boundaries of the thin plates that cover the Earth like an eggshell. Driven by the deep heat within the Earth's core, the plates grind against each other along lines called faults. When the plates find their motion blocked, stress builds up, and then finally the fault gives way. The released energy races through the Earth in the form of seismic waves. The earthquake that struck California on October the 17th registered a magnitude of 7.1, a moderately severe tremor. Yet even in an area that prides itself on being prepared for the Earth's occasional spasms, hundreds of homes were destroyed and thousands of people were left without shelter. In the hills nearest the epicenter, there were dozens of narrow escapes.
I felt like when the house started coming down this way, though, that this room was next, and I thought that I was either going to be hurt severely or get killed in this house, definitely. It went through my head. I was very scared. We were ready to have this baby, and we'd done a lot of work, and it's just really beginning to be home.
My mom was just getting ready to take a shower when it started shaking, and my dad was in the kitchen area with her too, and they made it out the front door and was thrown on the driveway because the shaking was so intense. Had enough time to turn around and look and see the house go down the hill with me in it, and they said it looked just like the house was blown up just like in the movies.
My daughter was right about where you are. I had just gotten her out of the basement. I'm sorry. I'd just gotten her out of the basement, or the downstairs, to come up and make a green salad, and I just told her I was going. I went out in fact, I was right in the door when it started to just shake a little bit. I was thrown to the floor, and she said, "Mother, get under the table." And then the fridge came down, and the ovens came down, and everything came down, and the floor was rumbling underneath us. It was like this. I mean, it was just up and down.
Because San Francisco was built on the San Andreas Fault, earthquakes have been moving it up and down and sideways ever since it was built. In 1905, the city was a thriving example of Northern California's newfound prosperity. A year later, on April 18th, 1906, that prosperity was shattered by the most famous earthquake in American history. During the quake and the fires that followed, most of the city was destroyed. Much of the charred rubble was pushed into the nearby bay, adding to an already unstable landfill that eventually became part of the city itself. Today, that landfill lies under a section of the Marina district, the area hardest hit by the recent quake. The problem here is the ground.
This is just a dump. People just threw stuff in here, and when it was shaken strongly, it just literally fell apart. One can wonder whether the real problem here is earthquakes, or whether the real problem is our inability to learn from and act intelligently upon the clear lessons of history. This is bad ground, and it shows.
The practice of building on bad ground is a problem throughout the world, especially in less developed countries. Mexico City was built on an unstable, dried-up lake bed. In 1985, 10,000 people died when a tremor hundreds of miles away turned the soft land into a nearly liquid mass. This is the modern horror. Countless tons of concrete and steel crushing its victims to death, or burying them alive. The task of excavating survivors from urban rubble has become so commonplace that new technologies are needed, like this tiny video probe, inching through the wreckage of a fallen high-rise, looking for signs of life, and, if they are lucky, finding it. Earthquakes have always destroyed human lives, but for the planet, they are an indispensable creative force.
If we didn't have earthquakes, if we didn't have this great flow of heat from the interior of the Earth would be a cold, dead place. If it wasn't for this great flow of heat, there'd be no continents, no oceans, no atmospheres. The Earth would be as dead and dry and cold as the moon. Everywhere you look in California, the hills are really created by the action of the earthquakes for the most part. It's really the earthquakes that create the topography, the valleys, the mountains, control the river streams where things go. The earthquakes really produce California.
Alan Lind is in charge of America's largest earthquake prediction experiment. The site is a sleepy town called Parkfield in central California. Every 22 years, on average, an earthquake of roughly magnitude 6 rumbles through Parkfield. The next one is due to hit any day.
Parkfield will really be our first opportunity anywhere on Earth to really capture an earthquake in all its glory, to really be sitting there waiting with all our tools out and sharpened and waiting to go.
The United States Geological Survey has spent millions of dollars wiring Parkfield. All over the valley, highly sophisticated instruments, like this laser, are poised to detect the tiniest movement along this part of the San Andreas Fault. If the Earth moves even a few millimeters before a quake strikes, seismologists will know about it and may be able to issue a warning. But even if they can't yet predict when an earthquake will strike here along the San Andreas Fault, they may be able to forecast where it will happen, if something called the seismic gap theory is correct.
Seismic gap theory is really just a very simple notion, and all it says is that since motion is occurring all along a plate boundary, there are going to be earthquakes everywhere along it, and the places that haven't had them last us are going to be the places to have them next us.
For 20 years, most of the seismic activity had occurred south of Loma Prieta. Then the '89 earthquake struck. Now the gap has moved north, towards the population centers of San Francisco and Oakland. But some veteran seismologists are skeptical that we'll ever be able to predict the behavior of earthquakes.
I think the prospects of being able to predict the day, time, and magnitude of a coming earthquake is virtually nil today. We have no clues on how to do it. The clues that we thought we had 15 years ago have all failed us.
Jack Evanen believes it makes more sense to focus our efforts on building sound structures.
To me, earthquakes are finite events, finite in size. I live in a home that I don't believe any earthquake can seriously assault. I work in a building that I don't think any earthquake can seriously assault. My only earthquake risk is if I happen to be on a overpass or bridge that collapses at the time of the earthquake.
Experience has taught us that certain structures, like bridges and freeways, are especially vulnerable to tremors. In the October 17th quake, most of the loss of life occurred on the Nimitz freeway, when a 1.5-mile section of the upper deck collapsed on the roadway beneath. Ed McVeigh was driving a freight truck when it happened.
there was no traffic, and I was doing about 55, and all of a sudden it felt like I had a blowout. I had no control over the truck. Luckily, there was nobody beside me, because I was just all over the place. I hit the brakes. In the rearview mirror, I could see what looked like the freeway falling, and that didn't make any sense. I saw cars and trucks disappearing underneath the rubble, and I just knew I was dead. I had no way of getting out of it. There was nothing I could do.
McVeigh was lucky that day. His truck just happened to stop under the only section of freeway that didn't fall. McVeigh escaped without a scratch, but scores of other motorists found themselves trapped in their cars or died. Tim Peterson was trapped lying sideways in the front seat of his white pickup truck.
I remember the sounds was a lot of crunching, and there were screams for just a couple seconds, and then everything was just quiet. And it was like somebody reached into a bag of cement, tossed it into your face from all the dust, and then that cleared. And then it was just a matter of getting out of there.
As 5 hours ticked slowly by, the upper freeway continued to settle until it was only inches above his head.
There was a good half hour there where the thoughts were running through my mind that I am going to die, and I thought my legs were cut off, and I thought I was just going to bleed to death. I was getting real sweaty and anxious, and I just thought I was going to die. So I closed my eyes and just waited, and it never seemed to happen.
Tim Peterson escaped the collapse of the Nimitz freeway with his life. 42 others did not. Yet in relative terms, San Francisco weathered the tremor extremely well, in large part because the city's tall buildings were constructed with earthquakes in mind, from designs that have been tested to withstand vibrations.
What earthquakes can do, even though they do release massive amounts of energy, depends upon the structures that that energy assaults. Poor structures, it'll destroy them. Good structures, it'll simply shake them.
Most Californians like to believe that their homes are earthquake-proof. They're not always right. A house that isn't firmly attached to its foundation can fall apart if it's shaken hard enough. Doran Adams sank a series of steel rods from the roof of his house to the foundation. The extra precaution paid off.
You can see there's no cracks. Very few. The aftershocks that we've had constantly under here, it's a constant rumbling underneath this house. I swear we're sitting over the top of it. We've got no structural damage at all, just slim to none.
Miraculously, only a few people died in their homes during the Loma Prieta quake, a testament to California's building code and the amount of money residents spend to make their homes safe. Too often, in the rest of the world, the opposite occurs. Just before Christmas, in 1988, a relatively mild 6.9 tremor struck the Soviet Armenian city of Leninakhan and its acres of cheap, shoddily constructed housing. 80% of the city was destroyed, and over 25,000 people lost their lives. Fortunately, Leninakhan was a small city. Tangshan, in northern China was not. Just before dawn, on July 28, 1976, an earthquake scored a direct hit on this major city. As near as anyone can tell, close to 250,000 people were killed.
Whole families were lost, so that it was not possible from the survivors to find out how many people had been killed. I don't think we've seen anything like that in an urban environment in the past, except at times of war. When you look at a map of the world and plot the truly great cities of the world and compare it with a map of the great, really destructive earthquakes of the last 1,000 years, there's an almost one-to-one correspondence. I think we may find ourselves witnessing a large number of destructive earthquakes in the next 3 or 4 decades that is going to really horrify the world.
The unsettling reality is that no place in the world is completely safe from earthquakes, not even areas where tremors are rare. The eastern United States is hardly a hotbed of seismic activity, but large earthquakes do happen here, and it's only a matter of time before the next one strikes.
The East Coast has to fear the occasional event that will come every 100 years or so at a locality that we have no capability to predict and will be felt over the entire eastern United States and will have damaging levels of ground motion over thousands of square miles. Tens of millions of people are living all over that area, and those structures have not been built with the idea of resisting earthquake assault.
Today in Northern California, the memory of what happened that day in October 1989 is receding, but it'll never vanish entirely.
We must recognize that earthquakes have no concern with the trivialities of the human life and living. And if small little man is intimidated by these small events, well, that's man's problem. That's not the Earth's problem.
Now, for a while at least, the ground seems solid beneath their feet. They get on with the daily business of their lives and push from their consciousness the certain knowledge that someday soon the restless earth will move again.
Well, next week on Voyager...